this? Thank you very much for having me. I'm always surprised when I hear my own biography thinking, wow, I've done all that stuff. It's kind of amazing. So we're talking about generations today. And the title is actually cribbed from our special issue of Work, Aging, and Retirement, which just came out, which I'll be talking a little bit more about. But certainly apologies to Dave Matthews with that. A little bit about kind of generations and this idea of, what's going on with the concept of generations and how long have we been talking about this. So a couple of quotes. The first, I see no hope for the future of our people if they are dependent on the youth of today. When I was young, we were taught to be discreet and respectful of our elders, but the present youth are exceedingly disrespectful and impatient, right? Sounds like millennials, right? Do you know when this was said? So it's attributed to Hesiod in the 8th century BC. Now, I have to put attributed in there because we're academics and some people have actually said, some Greek scholars have actually said he never said that. Other people said Socrates said it. So I'll leave it to Hesiod up there for now and say it's certainly believable that this was said thousands of years ago. Slightly more recently, kids, I don't know what's wrong with these kids today from Bye Bye Birdie in 1963 and on and on and on and on. So this idea that generations, that people are different, that the current generation is different than previous generations is certainly not a new idea by any sense of the imagination. So the question that I have about this is there something there? Are there really generations? And this is obviously with apologies to Gertrude Stein. Is there a there? Are generations really a thing? If they are, what are they? Where did they come from? What impact do they have? And if they're not, why do we continue to talk about them? So that was loud. So there's a lot of stories and a lot of anecdotes. Most of the kind of pop press stories about generations are these kind of, I know someone who, and there's workers, and what's wrong with kids these days, and so forth. The empirical evidence backing up the idea of generations is a lot less robust. And really what we found in looking at this is a lot of things that look like generational differences aren't really that. They look like it, they appear to be generational differences, but they seem to be something else that's going on there. And so what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what we know and what we don't know and what I think we should do next. It's a nice small group, so if you have questions along the way, feel free to ask, stop, and I can kind of fill in the blanks along the way so you don't have to hold your questions. So start off with this kind of anecdote idea, right? So the generational differences. So here's a mythical millennial. We actually came across this person, if you will, using a popular millennial quiz, like one of the things, clickbait things. How millennial are you? All right, so Joe can't find a job. He'd happy to be doing something that pays enough just to cover the rent. He's got some tattoos. He skips a newspaper but reads news on the internet and enjoys video games, uses his cell phone to stay in touch, sending and receiving text and updating his Facebook page. He's politically moderate. He was raised by a single mom on public assistance. Overall, though, he kind of feels disaffected and isolated by the economy, frustrated by the difficulty of finding a job, and kind of the impersonal, material-driven nature of the bosses for whom he has worked. Sounds like a millennial, right? It's kind of all the stereotypical characteristics of a millennial. So one of my colleagues and I came across this quiz and identified this stereotypical millennial, and then because we're academics, we looked through all the questions and tried to figure out alternate explanations for why someone would answer the way they would, right? And so it actually turns out that Joe is a 65-year-old disabled unemployment vet, right? A Vietnam veteran. He moves a lot. He doesn't have a home. He uses a cheap cell phone, which is all he has. He's given up on contacting the Veterans Administration because they don't seem to help him. And he looks very millennial and is not. So basically you've got this profile of, yeah, that's a millennial, disaffected, tattoos, disconnected, dissatisfied, and actually you could get a score 14 out of 15 on the millennial quiz if you're Joe and you look like this. So if the stereotypes don't seem to be quite right, what else is going on? What's going on here? A couple other few fun facts. One, this is the interactive part. What's the most common way for millennials to get to work? You think about millennials, urban, bicycles, Uber, stuff like that. What's the most common way that millennials get to work now? They drive. How do they drive?
By themselves.
They drive alone, right? So millennials are like everybody else. The most common way they get to work is they drive by themselves. That's from the Co-Good School Survey. The top factors impacting occupational choice. That's another kind of stereotype or some differences that are out there, like millennials are different than. So baby boomers from 1981 to 1992, when this data was collected, these are the top 5 reasons they picked their occupation. challenge, advancement, security, salary, and importance. And clearly millennials are different, right? They're going to have a different set of categories. But if you look at millennials from 2009, slightly different order: security, benefits, challenge, importance, and salary, but pretty much the same 5. This is data that's collected by the FAA. So the work values don't seem to be different. And the last one, this is from the Army actually. Millennials show much higher pride joining the military than Generation X did when they joined. So something about millennials and the Army, and I don't know if it's job security, it's the economy, whatever, when they get in there, they have a lot more pride, right? But that's actually true of everybody who's joined the Army recently as opposed to in the past. So whether you're a boomer, an Xer, or a millennial, in general, pride in the Army has gone up. And not surprisingly, one of the key events that impacted it was 9/11. This is what's known as a period effect. And if you look at 20-year-olds over time and 40-year-olds over time, they just track together. So something is causing pride in the military to go up or down. It's clearly not what generation you're in. So now we've got some stereotypes that don't seem quite right. We've got some things that should be differences but aren't necessarily the case. And so my thought was, if there is a there, if there are generations, this is what you should see. So this is over time and some random variable, pick whatever variable you want. And you should see nice little groupings. So if you're born here, this should be your score. And if you're born here, this should be your score. And you see these nice breaks, right? Because there's differences. And what we typically see on almost every variable where there is any change at all, not surprisingly, is that, right? This, it goes up, it goes down, but it's not this nice clean stair step that you kind of would expect to see. When there are differences, they gradually change over time. So we don't see the, yeah.
What's the difference there? What's the ordinate there?
Well, this is just some random variable. Doesn't really, the point is these two variables are the same. If there were generational differences on this scale, you would see this. And what you really see is that over time, the scores change, but they change gradually up and down, not in some sort of kind of clear stair-step pattern. Right? So that's kind of just, kind of some background, some anecdotes, some stories, some little fun facts. What do we know about the literature about generations? A lot of what is there has come from kind of the popular press. What do we know about the academic literature? Well, I tried to come up with the right word for this. Eesh is the best one I could come up with. Oh my, yuck are all words. The academic, like quality empirical literature about this is really not very good. It's mixed at best in terms of the results. At worst, you could call it uninterpretable because it's contradictory. I'll show you some results later on about that. Missing theories, missing data sets, or missing chunks of data, limited numbers of variables that have been looked at. It's really quite messy. And what it leads to is a lot of questions about things like just the definition of what a generation is. As an example of the state of the literature, Cooper-Schmidt 2000 is a definition that gets used for generations a lot. She basically made it up. It's in a paper that's like in a nursing journal. And it got cited once, and then it got cited again, and now kind of everybody cites Cooper-Schmidt 2000 to the point that now I'm actively not citing it. I'm trying to cite something else to kind of not perpetuate this. But there's really no basis behind her definition other than that's what she wrote, right? There's questions about the mechanisms. How does a generation come about, right? If you would see that stair step, why? Right? Why would there be these kind of clear delineations? If you go back to Mannheim, and then Strauss and Howe, kind of the sociological view of generations, the idea is that people at critical developmental stages in their life experience things. And if they're at the same age and they experience this thing, that makes them more similar to each other than not, right? So you say, oh, okay, well, so if you're growing up during the Depression, then you didn't have much money and you had to scrimp and save, and that makes you very thrifty, right? So if you're growing up, whatever that means, in some sort of developmental stage, you end up being super, super thrifty. What we do know about that is that anybody who lived through the Depression was thrifty, regardless of whether you're 18 or 60 or whatever. So the mechanism doesn't quite have a good backing for it. It's just kind of, if you experienced it, you'll be more similar than not, and that's kind of the mechanism, which has never really been tested. And then there's all sorts of questions about methods, about measurement, about the stats. How do you test for generational differences? The most common way of testing is using a cross-sectional survey approach. So you go to an organization, you had a bunch of surveys, you say, gee, 20-year-olds answered this way, and 40-year-olds answered this way, and 60-year-old answered this way. There's generational differences. And of course, the problem with that is that it confounds age with generation, or career stage with generation, or life stage with generation, or rank in the organization. It confounds many variables with what possibly could be a generation. Some people have looked at other types of methodologies using existing data sets that have been collected over time, nothing longitudinal, but like cross-sectional panels. That has its own problems. The measurement of what a generation is, who's in it, who's not. In most studies, do you know how you identify what generation someone's in? You ask them, what generation are you? Check, right? In one of our papers, we actually went back and looked at how generations had been defined. And I didn't put this chart up here, but you would expect that kind of stair-step approach. And what you get is it overlaps dramatically. Sometimes, well, I'm a perfect example. I was born in 1964. Depending on who's studying me, I'm either an Xer or a boomer or a gapper. So I have 3 sets of stereotypes about me depending on, you know, how I was defined in that study. And so if you really can't tell who's in the group and how the group is defined and how to study the group, it's kind of hard to say the group is the thing. And then the last thing are the statistics that have been used. None of the statistics that have been used in any generational study actually can separate out the 3 main possible causes of these differences, right? So you're a certain way in this framework. There's 3 things that could cause that. One is how old you are. One is the group that you're in. And the third is when I'm asking you, right? So age, period, and cohort effects. Lots has been written about those. There's no statistical technique that can tease that out unless I have multiple longitudinal panels. So I got to ask 100 people in 1960, and then get those 100 people and another 100 people in 61, and those 200 and another 163, and blah, 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 and on and on, right? So if I do 161 and get a different 162 and a different 163, I can't tear this apart. If I do it cross-sectionally, I can't tear it apart. And there are no studies that I'm aware of that have looked at generational differences using a true longitudinal multiple panel data set. So the stats are all kind of dancing around this. You can use analysis of variance. You can use cross-temporal meta-analysis, which one subset of people who are into generational differences use quite a bit, even though they admit it doesn't separate out the effects. Cross-classified hierarchical linear modeling is another way to do this, which seems to make sense because you can actually tease out age, period, and cohort, except you have to specify 2 of the 3 up front, and you can specify any 2 that you want. So you can say, well, I'll specify age and period, and then whatever's left is cohort, right? But you could just as easily specify age and cohort, and whatever's left is period. So it's kind of arbitrary how you specify it. So again, with a cross-sectional data set of, or cross-sectional panels, you just can't separate this effect out. So anyone who says the research shows that there's generational differences, no, it doesn't. It shows there might be some differences, but why they're there, what they're attributable to is unclear. So that's why I go back to ish. It's kind of like ish. So just a little bit about some more of these things and kind of where the research is headed. So a lot of this research is actually, shameless self-promotion, is coming from our special issue on generations. So Rudolph and Zucker suggested a developmental framework for individual changes over time. This is getting at that definition of what a generation is. Maybe what we should think about is how an adult or teen, young adult, middle age changes developmentally. And those changes might be indicative of what we kind of think of as being generational differences. So like when an adult shifts from being dependent on their parents to being independent, or when they shift from being single to having a family, those type of developmental shifts might be the breakpoints. So it doesn't make a difference whether you're 25 or 30 or 35 or 40. Getting married and has kids is what puts you into a separate group. Finishing up high school and going independent. I mean, it's a different way of thinking about this besides the kind of calendar-based groups. And Perry and Irwin talked about the possibility of inducing generations, basically looking for the differences that are there and then seeing if you can find out where the breakpoints are. So rather than saying boomers and millennials and Xers, say where's the breakpoint. So if you go back to that line chart or go back to the pride in the military chart, finding, well, where's it shift? And then figuring out maybe that's a more natural grouping. So these are just like alternates to thinking about the way we group people that are not 1946 to 1964, 1965 to 1981, and 1981 to 2000. And then if you can figure out what the new generation is going to be called, copyright it and sell it because you'll make a bunch of money. And also, I like this one in particular, Campbell et al. And the et al. In there is Twenge, who is the big generational differences person. She's the one who uses cross-temporal meta-analysis. And so we invited her to participate in the special issue because we wanted all the positions in there. And much to my surprise and joy, her research found no clear breakpoints in generational differences on some of the variables that she had been looking at. So what she actually presented, Campbell actually wrote, he's the lead author, but she's on it. Basically, they showed that kind of gradual change over time. They didn't show the stair-step relationship, which kind of, again, argues against the idea of clearly defined generational differences. So I was particularly pleased with that paper. Some work on the mechanisms. Jess Badger Darrow, who's at ARI, and I and some other folks, we looked at that mechanism piece, right? So if the idea is that people of a certain age experience things and it makes them more similar to each other than not, we said, well, let's test that. So we found a cross-sectional, cross-temporal data set that administered measures to similar measures across time, across countries. So there's like 80 countries represented. In the United States, the GSS, the General Social Survey, General Social Survey that's our piece, but that gets replicated in lots of other countries translated. And so what we did is we picked 3 years and 3 countries that were geographically very diverse, and then looked to see whether there was a unique age, country, year of data collection interaction, because that's basically what a generational effect would be. So if you're 20 years old in Hungary in 1987, does that make you different than being 20 in 1987 in Israel or the United States, and different than being 40 in Hungarian in 1987 or 20 in Hungarian in 2005, right? All the different combinations. And the idea being is that if there are these kind of unique interactions between how old you are and an event, you should see some interactions. You should see some three-way interactions. And you might say, well, three-way interactions are very hard to find. They are, but our data set had about 15,000 people in it, so we figured we had enough power to find them if they were there. Shockingly, no, nothing. What we found is huge country effects. So the country that you're in, what you experience, definitely impacts you. So we're looking at things like job satisfaction and work values and life values and stuff like that. And not surprisingly, there's a huge difference, say, in Hungary before and after the wall. And there's a huge impact in Israel before and after whatever the second to go Palestinian-Israeli conflict was. And there were country-to-country differences in the same years, but there was no unique aspect of it. It's not like being 20 in Hungary in 1987 made a particular difference. So that kind of raises questions about this whole mechanism idea. And no one's really done anything more than that with it in terms of figuring out, like, how does a generation actually form? What's the mechanism by which you all become more similar to each other than this group, than that group? It just, no one's ever demonstrated it. They say it's there, but there's no really evidence for it. A little bit about the methods and the measurement and the stats. I love this study. Alyssa Perry up at Columbia did this with some colleagues, and she looked at thinking about kind of how do you measure a generation and what goes with it. And so she came up with this really cool study where she asked people for their perceptions about people of different categories, and she did 60-year-olds and boomers and 29-year-olds and millennials. And if it's not age-based, then those two things should be the same, because 29's in the middle of millennials and 60's in the middle of boomers. And what she found is that the perceptions varied quite a lot based on how the person was primed in terms of describing them. The lowest ratings in terms of least productive, least flexible, least likely to be hired were 60-year-olds. Sorry. And 60-year-olds were rated much worse than baby boomers, even though they represented the same group. The same thing, interestingly, was true of 29-year-olds and millennials. 29-year-olds were rated lower than millennials. And this was true between and within subjects in 2 different data collections. So if the stereotypical characteristics vary as a function of how you ask the question, then what's the value of saying someone's a millennial or saying someone's a baby boomer? And our study that was in this paper, we took the 3 main statistical techniques that have been used, analysis of variance, cross-sectional, cross-temporal meta-analysis, and cross-classified HLM, and applied them to the same data set. So we took the 3 techniques, found 2 big archival data sets, and applied the techniques to them to see, well, does the technique you use make a difference? And you can't see that, but of course the answer is yes. So just for example, if you look at, this is intent to remain in the Army. If you do cross-sectional, depending on the data set and when the data is collected, you get either Gen X is lowest, millennials are lowest, or there is a generational effect, but we're not sure why, right? If you look at job satisfaction, you get no differences. Millennials are lower, Gen X is lower. There is a generation effect. There's no generation effect. So if you want to find generational differences, I can tell you, do some sort of cross-sectional analysis of variance and you'll find them. If you want to find complicated ones, use cross-temporal meta-analysis. And if you want to not find them, then use cross-classified hierarchical linear modeling because you most likely won't. So what's it tell you about a concept if the statistical technique will determine what your results are, right? So that's problematic. And we tried this on two different data sets. One was the GSS, which we used, and the other was SSMP, which is a data set that's collected by the Army. And both of those data sets are, the sample sizes were huge, like 30,000 or 50,000 or something like that. So these are not small like effects. I'm saying, well, there's no effect at all. It's like there is literally no effect. And when there were effects, there were oftentimes 1/10 of a standard deviation, 1/20th of a standard deviation. R-squareds of like 0.01 were significant because, of course, we had huge sample size. So we're not talking like boomers or a standard deviation above millennials or vice versa. We're talking little microscopic effects or no effects or flipped effects, depending on the statistic that you use. And this isn't surprising. If you read the paper, you'll see that the technique, like cross-sectional, confounds age and generation, right? So you will find certain effects there, but not elsewhere. Cross-classified confounds something else. Cross-temporal confounds something else. So depending on what it confounds, you'll find the other effect, right? So if you want to find generations, that's why you use cross-sectional, because it confounds age and generation, and there are age differences because 20-year-olds and 60-year-olds in the workplace are different from each other. It'll look like a generational effect, but it's not. It's probably age or career stage. So what are some trends with this? Well, I'm going to stop. Any questions on this? That's a lot. Nothing? Makes sense? Crystal clear? Okay. So like where's the research going? What's coming up? I think some of the work that's interesting to me on this is focusing on the perceptions, right? If there really aren't the kind of age event interactions that are actually changing people, maybe our focus could be on the perceptions that people are different. And if you go back to some of those early quotes, that's kind of what's wrong with kids these days? And millennials are fill in the blank, whatever negative characteristic you want. Where do those perceptions come from? Are they pop press? Do they result from conflict in the workplace? Do they result from real differences that are attributable to something else, like career stage or age or something like that? So I think if we could maybe focus on what the basis of some of these perceptions are, that might shed some light on this phenomenon and maybe provide us with some kind of alternate explanations for it. I mentioned that a little bit. Some folks in San Francisco are looking at San Francisco State are doing research on the intergroup conflict aspect of this. So maybe identifying the sources of conflict. If you think about millennials are now the ones who have kids and like employee assistance programs and daycare assistance services and things like that versus millennials who are younger, who are less likely to have kids, maybe like the source of conflicts over benefits or services or flexible work schedules that are completely age-based or life stage-based are the basis of some of these stereotypes. Like you're not motivated and you're not dedicated and you cut out. I have to go take care of my kids, but you could stay and work later and you're not willing to do that. Therefore, you're lazy, and because you're 29, you're a millennial, right? And there's some possibility that maybe some of these sources of work conflict that we kind of know about are leading to or enhancing this idea of kind of perceptions about generational differences. And I think what's needed is just a lot more work on the statistical and analytical and design issues. I had a recent exchange with Twenge. She's the big CTMA person. Cross-temporal meta-analysis, thank you. So cross-temporal meta-analysis is basically if you take like the General Social Survey or the not the National Longitudinal Survey, the high school student one, which I'm blanking on, but basically collect data from high school students every year, but it's different people collecting it, right? Or narcissism, the Narcissism Personality Index has been collected, and we're actually doing a study with that. So you find any time the NPI was administered to college students, and then use those studies as the original data source, and then you meta-analyze it, but because you've controlled age, it's all college students, becomes a cross-temporal meta-analysis to see whether or not narcissism has changed in 20-year-olds over time. So it's basic meta-analytic techniques, but applied to kind of a temporal frame. But again, as Twenge has actually admitted, much I think to her chagrin, because I keep citing it over and over and over and over again, cross-temporal meta-analysis confounds generation with time period. So you don't know if if narcissism is going up or down because they're 20 or because you asked in 1982 or 83. In fact, we're working on a study related to this, and we have some evidence, early evidence, that narcissism is very strongly related to the stock market. So as the stock market goes down, the narcissism goes down with it. And as the stock market picks up, indicating the economy is better and there's more jobs and things like that, narcissism goes back up. There's actually a really strong decrease in narcissism after 2008, not surprising. And so you think about it, 2003, 4, there's a boom, doesn't make a difference where I graduate, I get a big paying job, I must be awesome. And then the recession hits and now there's no more jobs and maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was. And so you see this kind of curve of narcissism that's correlated with the economy. We see some similar things with the Army in terms of like pride in the Army and intent to re-enlist that are related to deployments, scandals, availability of other jobs. Like the unemployment rate is a predictor of attrition in the Army. Not surprising. If the unemployment rate is lower, people are more likely to leave because they have other job options. It's not a generational thing. It's a period effect. Anyway, cross-temporal meta-analysis confounds period and generation. But no one's ever really dug into the statistics behind it. It's just kind of Twenge and her group came up with it or adopted it. It gets published and used over and over and over again, but no one's ever really like torn it apart in a psychometric kind of way. The cross-classified piece and age period and cohort effects has been studied a lot. I can give you all sorts of references on that. But in the end, everybody pretty much says the same thing, which is you got 3 variables, you got to fix 2 of them. Pick 2. Right? And you can pick any 2 you want, and depending on the 2 you pick, the third one is going to be different, right? And then just design issues. I mean, could you look at the perceptual idea, the conflict idea, and figure out different ways of trying to study generational differences? I get a lot of calls and emails from doctoral students who are doing the dissertation and said, I'm really interested in, job involvement among millennials and Gen Xers, and I've designed this cross-sectional survey. Can you advise me on that? And my advice is always don't do it. Figure out some other way to study what you perceive to be these differences. But if you look at the studies that are out there, the vast majority of them just use these kind of cross-sectional surveys. When we published our meta-analysis in 2012, we started off with about 200 studies that we thought we might be able to include. By the time we had narrowed it down for various reasons, we were down to about 20. And out of the 20, all 20 of them are cross-sectional. There was nothing that was not a cross-sectional analysis. So we actually had some trouble getting the meta-analysis published because we know cross-sectional studies are inherently flawed, and we were saying something about generations using an inherently flawed study. And our argument was, well, that's the state of the literature. We're summarizing it. We're telling you what's there. And eventually it found a home in the Journal of Business Psych, and it's actually been cited quite a bit and has done quite well. But we admit we were meta-analyzing studies that were inherently flawed. So I think we need to do more work there if we're really going to figure out what this thing is. A little bit about practice issues. So like from a practical perspective, what's this mean for organizations? In general, you could say generational, but in general, stereotypes, they're kind of time-saving cognitive heuristics, right? It's like, oh, you're a millennial, so you're this, or oh, you're a woman, so you're that, or any of the other stereotypes that we happen to have. And so I would lump generational stereotypes into those groups. Is that if a hiring manager or an organization or an HR person has stereotypes about millennials or boomers or Xers or whatever, if Alyssa's study about 60-year-olds is true, then if HR people have different stereotypes about boomers and 60-year-olds, that has implications for the organization. It also has implications for 60-year-olds who are applying for jobs. We try to make sense of the environment, and we see these differences that are out there. And generational membership is very visible. It's kind of a proxy for age. It's a proxy for career stage. And we see a lot of examples of people who meet our expectations. And so that kind of bias towards confirming the stereotypes that we have. If you look at the millennial stereotypes, every day at GW I see kids that are antithetical to those stereotypes, but talk to HR managers, and the ones they know about are the kids who come in and kind of fulfill those stereotypical expectations. So there's some practice concerns with the stereotypes and the use of these stereotypes. In particular, there's legal concerns and then performance concerns. From a legal standpoint, we have the Civil Rights Act and ADEA and ADA, and et cetera. There's no Generational Discrimination in Employment Act. So if I don't want to hire you because you're a millennial, guess what? I can. In fact, if I don't want to hire you because you're a baby boomer, I probably can, unless someone can turn it into an Age Discrimination Act claim. So generations as a group are not protected, and that obviously creates problems. More and more of the workforce is covered under the age component of it, though. So for conflating age and generations, and I'm discriminating against you because you're a baby boomer, or now some Gen Xers are protected as well. Now we start to get into potential age claims, right? And ADEA is 40 plus, and millennials or Xers are born as late as 81. So there are definitely millennials who are Xers who are in the 40 plus range, and all of them will be in 40 plus in the next 4 or 5 years. In terms of legal concerns, I also put this up here. This is a couple of quotes that we found, so I have to read this out loud because I like it. If you can get them pick young married women, they usually have more of a sense of responsibility than do their unmarried sisters. They're less likely to be flirtatious. As a rule, they need the work or they wouldn't be doing it. General experience indicates that husky girls, those who are just a little bit on the heavy side, are likely to be more even-tempered and efficient than their underweight sisters. Be tactful in issuing instructions or making criticisms. Women are often sensitive, and they can't shrug off harsh words the way that men do. Never ridicule a woman. It breaks her spirit and cuts her efficiency. Horrifying, yes? Right? So this is from Mass Transportation Magazine in 1943. So it does sound horrible. I particularly like it because growing up I had to buy husky jeans because I was a little on the heavier side. So this one kind of resonates with me. But contrast this with, these people are lazy, entitled, recognition hungry. You have to constantly praise them. They're more interested in online activities than actual life pursuits and relationships. They're informal. They won't even pick up the phone to resolve issues. Not quite as socially horrifying, but are these any worse stereotypes than the ones from above? And these are all quotes from millennials in popular press news stories in 2015. So you start thinking about the impact these stereotypes have. Why are we horrified about the first one? We, ubiquitously, and we look at the second one and go, yeah, that's kind of what they're like, right? These are equally problematic from a legal perspective, and they're equally problematic from a performance perspective. If that's your expectation about all 29-year-olds, guess what? That's the kids you're hiring. Those are the kids who are going into the workplace. And if they're all like that, then the future of all businesses and organizations are in serious, serious trouble. So, those myths and stereotypes can lead to all sorts of unnecessarily broad actions. When I first started looking at this, one of the popular press stories I came across was a story about a consultant in the Washington area who deemed herself the generational guru. And she was being brought into organizations to tell them how to treat their millennial employees, right? And you know what her big piece of advice was? This still sticks in my head. She had a laminated card that she could hand out to the older managers that had all the language that the millennials used so that the baby boomers would understand what they were talking about. That was her big thing. Now that's a relatively minor consulting intervention, but when you start thinking about, is it true that all millennials seek excessive recognition? Does an organization go out and redo its entire performance appraisal system to deal with this? If the stereotype is correct, then yeah, we should kind of redo this whole thing. What we see, fortunately, is organizations redoing performance appraisals because the old versions of performance appraisals aren't as effective as we need them to be, and they're trying out different models, right? But not just increased attention. If you go back to that FAA data, you can actually do some kind of fun mapping between performance appraisal and compensation systems and the reasons that people get into work. And you could end up with, if you look at work values, you could end up with entirely different performance appraisal systems for different generations if you believe the stereotypes. Right? And I kind of talk, any assessments based on this, lost opportunities, wasted resources, misinformed selection decisions. If you believe these stereotypes, then none of the kids who were in my class earlier today who were applying for jobs should get one. right? Because they're lazy and entitled and uncommitted and not going to stay with the organization, and they only care about virtual life and all that. And I mean, we know that's kind of ridiculous. So at this point in time, I oftentimes get accused of saying, well, are you saying that everybody's always the same? And the answer is no, I'm not saying that. I don't think I've ever said that. There is a there, right? On average, there are differences between older and younger workers. That's not surprising. The fact that people's motivations change, their life situation changes, there's some evidence that personality changes in some way or another. Their work-life balance situation changes. So the things do change over time from older and younger workers, and things also change over time from 1940 to 1950 to 2000, right? So I'm not saying that people aren't different, and I'm not saying that times aren't different. The question is, why are they different, and what can we do about it? Even when there are differences, there's a huge range of characteristics within cohorts. I mean, we kind of know that. Even if there are mean differences, oftentimes the distributions themselves are highly overlapping. So trying to make generational attributions based on means is certainly problematic. As a sidebar, another project I'm working on right now is trying to look at the variance component. So let's say the means are here, but the distributions massively overlap. Can you find a point in time where people experience a common event and makes them more similar to each other, which means the variances get smaller? Can you actually find that in the data? Can you actually see narcissism variation get smaller as a result of external events, which is what the Strauss and Howe and Mannheim thought, mechanisms would suggest. And early answer is no. Not only do the means not change very much, but the variances are almost perfectly consistent. So there's no evidence, at least so far, that external events cause people to be more similar to each other than not, either on means or on variances. And like I said, the differences that we found are more likely attributable to period or age or individual differences or technology or 47 other variables rather than this idea of generational membership. But, and here's the but that I get from practitioners, if people buy into the stereotypes, they do have an impact. Right? So if HR managers believe this, if organizations believe these stereotypes, it will impact the workplace. It will impact their hiring systems and their selection and compensation systems. It will impact how the organization is structured and intergroup dynamics. So it's not to say that these don't have a real impact, but I think our focus has been on the wrong thing. Our focus has been on these artificially calendar-based groups and not what the underlying causes of these changes, these differences actually are. So kind of this is where I am after working on generations for 7 years now, I think. There's a huge difference between being caused by generational membership and being characteristic of various age groups. And we practitioners, pop press, and some academics conflate the two. If you are in this age group and you have this characteristic, it's because you're in that group. And we haven't really gotten at the actual causes of the differences that are there. Rather, we've just used these age groups as kind of a convenient heuristic for it. And so the kind of next step here is I think we need to kind of focus on the real differences, the causes of the differences, and not the stereotypes and myths and these generational groups that seem to explain them, but as far as we can tell, really don't. A couple acknowledgments. Lisa Finkelstein, my colleague and partner in crime, co-author, and we've done a lot of this work together. Grad students, Nikki, Jessica, Jamie, Allison, Rebecca, Meredith Coates, Jay Goodwin. I put Paul Gady in bold because he's here today, but I also put him in bold because this whole thing is his fault. Oop, I jumped ahead. The whole thing is his fault. So as Diane said, I've been a senior consortium fellow for the Army Research Institute for 15 years now, 16 years now. And in 2009 or 10, I don't remember what year it was, Paul Gady's boss's boss read something somewhere about the difficulty the Army was going to have retaining millennials. And his boss's boss asked his boss about it, and his boss asked him about it. And since I've been working with Paul for a while, he said, hey, what do you know about generations? And I said, nothing. And he said, well, go find out and let me know what you find. And that led to a lit review, which led to the meta-analysis, which led to this whole stream of research. So you can either thank him or curse him. I thank him, but it is in fact Paul's fault. Any questions? Not you.
No, I get this. Isn't this really, you solved the problem, haven't you? Shown that this really is stereotype that, or stereotypes that were created by social scientists. And part of the reason why it sticks so much is because they put up a veneer of scientific credibility behind it. But they're making a ton of money doing this stuff. Strauss and Howe and all the rest of them, Twenge and all the rest of them, are making a whole lot of money doing this. So they want to perpetuate.
I can't disagree with any of that. I mean, I think if you go back and read Strauss and Howe's original book, right? They took what I think is an interesting approach. I've always said if I weren't a psychologist, I'd be a historian, because I think history is interesting in that what does it teach us about today, as opposed to in 1642 this thing happened. But the Strauss and Howe model originally was to go back in time and to look at 20-year groups, because 20 years is literally a familial generation, you know, parent to child, and say from 1660 to 1680, what were the critical historical events and how did they change people? And then from 1680 to 1700, what were the critical events and how did they change people? And they replicated that all the way up until 1980, right? And there's a couple things about that. One is it was a historical sociological study of retrospective assessment of these events and how they impacted people. What struck me about it is that each chapter the generation has a name, and each chapter has a list of critical events, right? So you see the French and Indian War, or the American Revolution, or the Civil War, or the women's suffrage. I mean, the kind of major historical events that in retrospect seem to be really, really important. And then you get up to the millennials, the Xers, and you find like the critical events for them is baby Jessica falling into a well, and the computer being named Man of the Year by Time Magazine. And you look at, like, in terms of historical heft between today and any time in the past, there's a big gap, just like a common sense gap. But it kind of makes sense because we don't know what the critical events are that are happening now until 60, 80, 100 years now. Some things, 9/11, you know, we know are serious events. Question or stop?
Oh, just somebody on Webcast has a question.
Oh, okay. Okay. So some events we know, but other things, you know, the current election, the current president might be a huge event in 60 or 80 years, or it might be just a historical blip, right? We don't know, and we won't know. So this idea to say that the things that are happening right now we know are critically affecting young people today is kind of nonsensical, and that's not what Strauss and Howe suggested was going to happen in their original book. But the book got super, super popular, and they sold lots and lots of copies of it, and they said, we could do something with this. So then they came out with a next book, and then more after that, and then that has led to this kind of whole industry. Jean Twenge is a big proponent of this. She and I certainly have had some disagreements about it. She sent me she is, and I'm upset by that. She sent me a very detailed criticism of one of the papers that I cited that just came out, which basically boiled down to we miscited one reference in a table. That was her big complaint about it. The rest of it was she disagreed with me, but her complaint was that we miscited one of her studies. I went to a presentation of hers at PSYOP, and the first slide that popped up, so my first slide was like, what do we know? And her first slide was, these are my 4 books. So you do the math.
Okay, so one of the questions is, can you repeat the citation for your note that the effects of living through the Depression didn't depend on life stage?
I cannot, I don't have a citation off the top of my head, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
The references at the end, these are all the articles that I cited. The fun facts were just, like I said, Co-Good School did a survey and the FAA data. If you want more of those. The specific reference about the Depression not affecting everybody, I don't have a specific example for it.
So. There's been some life course research that was done on depression kinds of things by Glenn Elder and some of his subject. I don't have a citation right offhand, but he did show some differences within people of various age groups as they experience depression, and also differences among various groups who experience, depending on their life stage, example, if you went off to war when you were young and single, it probably didn't have a huge negative impact on your life. But if you were married and had children and you went off to war, it had a very deleterious effect on your life. Same sort of thing with the depression stuff. But Glenn Elder and his associates in the life course research have quite a bit of stuff.
Other questions? You can ask another one if you want.
No, do I get a
Well,
question?
well, someone else. We'll come back to you.
That struck me if some of the ways this thing keeps going. Yeah, having tried to help provide fully serving yourself for generations and watching the whole management on how to tackle the issue of managing people better. These kind of things are great in briefing slides, and they can feel with it, especially if they think they're finding a way to capture these for the younger workers with new skills and so on. So there's a lot of self-serving, just like any stereotype, there's a lot of self-serving things that keep it going. And it's partly, I think, just to try to get a simple approach that also makes you look good and even trying to.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's kind of the, so what should organizations be doing instead? And my answer is what we do already, right? You do job analysis and you design good selection systems and you figure out what the critical KSAPs are and you hire people based on that. And, you know, if people seem uncommitted to the work, figure out why and change your reward system or change your work structure or change the people you hire or anything else. I mean, we know how to deal with most of this, right? I mean, how do you deal with other stereotypes? Women are bad leaders because they're so compassionate and they're not aggressive and assertive enough. Well, laws to a certain extent, but also you go out and find leaders who have the characteristics that you want. And if you want an aggressive, assertive leader, you find an aggressive, assertive leader regardless of what or who they are. And if you want a compassionate, kind leader, you find a compassionate, kind leader regardless of who or what they are. You know, if you want to increase people's interpersonal skills so they're not so reliant on technology to communicate, then give them training and give them opportunities to interact with real live human beings and have, you know, technology-free zones or whatever else. And we know how to do all this. It's not magic. It's not, we don't need consultants to say, well, millennials, you have to, you know, LOL means laugh out loud. I mean, it's like, it's absurd. So, the stereotypes are convenient. They're shortcuts. And the answer is, you're like, well, how do we deal with millennials? Well, how do you deal with anybody? If you have an employment problem, an employee problem, a training problem, train, motivate, reward, change the position, change the person, get a new boss. I mean, all the stuff that we would know how to do. That's not very sexy. It doesn't sell a lot of books, unfortunately, and believe me, it does not get you on television. Yes, sir.
I'm just curious if the generational research has ever looked at whether or not there's been changes in actuarial tables. I can remember the first time I felt like I was discriminated against because of my age and my personal life was when I learned that my insurance as a 19-year-old, my car insurance, was so high compared to my girlfriend, right? And compared to my other friend, my other female friend who was married, her insurance was much lower. And I thought, how? You know, I'm just curious if those tables have changed over time, if that's just something that they've looked at or not.
I don't know. That's an interesting question. So the question is like to have actuarial tables changed over time. Yeah. That's a really good idea. I mean, if you could get access to probabilities and people's, like, we know people have gotten married older and have kids later and things like that, but are there kind of distinctive patterns that are there? And again, you could look at it, are they kind of stair-step patterns or gradual change patterns? Yeah, it's an interesting data source. Again, it's cross-sectional panels, so you could look at 19, 20, 21, 22 in a particular year and then look at the following year. But, you know, at this point, I was talking to one of the grad students on Monday because we just got these 3 pieces out. We got another one under review. We're doing the variance study right now, so we just we're working on the analyses for the variance study to see whether or not the variance is pinch. We're talking about what the next one's going to be, and my dream study is to look at, because right now we're looking at one variable, narcissism, in 20-year-olds, right, to see whether or not the variance is constrained by any external events. which it should be, but it's not. So I said, okay, well, it's only one variable, it's only one age group. So my dream version of this is, kind of a 3D chessboard version where you have 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and 60-year-olds, and you have maybe narcissism and job satisfaction and some sort of life piece, and you've got multiple data sets, and then you could look to see whether or not 9/11 changed narcissism for 20-year-olds but not anybody else, and whether Vietnam changed materialism for boomers but not silent generation or Gen Xers. So you would get these like little inflection points in this 3D view. I can't imagine it would work, but if it would, it'd be really, really cool. But the point of that is like, well, what's next? I mean, how many times can we kind of keep pecking away at this? Another study that we're talking about doing, one of my new grad students coming in the fall has a family, she's part of a family business that's in its 5th generation, literal parent-child generation. And so she and I are talking about doing a kind of a qualitative study to see whether or not the familial generation is a more powerful impact than the calendar-based generation, which you certainly would expect that it would be, but because it's a big family business that she's in, she has access to some other family businesses, so we're going to see like family business A, B, and C, maybe in 1 or 2 countries, familial generation, calendar-based generation, and see if we can kind of tear that out. So, ideas about data sets and future studies and stuff, I mean, I'm happy to keep talking about this, but I just keep saying, nope, nope, no, nope, that one didn't work either. Nope, not there. So, yeah.
The question I had is, done this stuff, blowing up all these stereotypes. You see an effect that it's been. Remember in the stuff, you and I attended the PSYOP session in 2010.
Yep.
Did deal with some of this, and I did a pre-convention workshop there, Paul Sackett, and we were talking about these hard to change kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
They sort of said, you can't do it. But do you get a sense that this is sort of overwhelming stuff?
What I'll say is that there is some traction to this. So, is this overwhelming? Is this unfixable? Anytime you're saying no to something, it's a lot harder than saying yes to something. I've been invited to talk to some business groups and talk to them, and they're very, very surprised at some of this variation of the scene, but basically what you think is true is probably not. I've gotten interviewed a few times. Jean Twenge is emailing me complaining about my studies, so I think that's a good sign. Yeah, so that's something. It's tough because the whole kind of millennial label itself, and then boomers and Xers as well, is just kind of ingrained in pop press for lots of other things too. Yeah, which
it's a euphemism for young people. It doesn't really mean anything with respect to cohort. It's young people.
Right. I mean, millennials by most definitions are 82 to 2000. So I mean, the oldest millennials they're getting up there, and the youngest ones are just about ready to go to college. So that's why I said if you can name the next one, there's big bucks in that. It's a little frustrating that the science doesn't back it up, but it continues to have a life. But I will say, people recognize me, and I get called, and I've done a few interviews where they said, "Oh, really? And it's ended up in some reasonable outlets." So I think that the key is to try to get into organizations and steer them away from it, and I'm not quite sure how to go about doing that because they're not reading the special issue on work, aging, and retirement. I mean, I hope so. One of the things I was really happy about in terms of the special issue is that we had 3 or 4 empirical pieces that got at it in different ways. And then we had 3 or 4 conceptual, theoretical, framing types of pieces that looked at the effect from a different perspective. And I kind of equate it to like the Mythbusters approach, which is you test the myth, and if you can't verify it, then you try to replicate the effect. It's like, okay, well, there are perceptions that are out there that these differences exist. Why? Let's not worry about the generational cause per se, but let's focus on the perceptions, or let's focus on the conflict. And that was really encouraging. I was really pleased that we got a number of papers that looked at that aspect of it, which suggests that, well, maybe this isn't a thing, and maybe if we came up with a better way of thinking about the thing, that might replace some of it. So I hope so. It's interesting, and like I said, it's certainly fertile for research. And we've got a few more things up our sleeve to try to nick away at it a little bit. If anybody wants to do a psych methods or psychometric piece on crest temporal meta-analysis, 100% you get in. It needs to be done. Almost every reviewer on a paper that we mentioned anything about CTMA said, gee, I really wish there was a comprehensive breakdown of CTMA and what it does and what it doesn't do. Everyone knows analysis of variance, cross-classified HLM and APC effects have been written about quite extensively, and CTMA is kind of in this hole in the middle where a couple people are using it to make a couple of points, but it's never really had a deep dive done on it. So if anybody's like a psychometrician and wants to get into it, have at it. Yeah.
First I wanted to thank you for doing this research, because I've been saying this for a while and no one was listening, but I didn't have any actual research to back it up. So I'm wondering if you've looked at, or you've considered, or you've had discussions at least around the idea that this stereotype is actually driving bias. Because that's, I think, more the experience that I'm seeing in organizations. Is that it's beyond a stereotype now, and that we have actual bias within the leadership against, millennials, as an example, and that it is driving change within the organization and how the employees are engaged when they fit into a particular age group or generation, and how opportunities are given to those in that generation as far as training, advancement, etc. So I think part of this, there was a question in there, but there's also opinions. I think part of this is that we need to get into organizations at the leadership level. We need to get into leadership programs, because as someone who's currently in a leadership program, they are teaching generational differences. And I know, and so thank you, that's my reaction. And so we have to get in there and say, no, there's a different way of thinking about this. And so I'm just wondering where you see this going, not just from the research standpoint, but from
the practice standpoint. Yeah, well, I think the answer to your question is, are the stereotypes driving behaviors? Yes, okay. and you're evidence of it. Slightly back to Paul's question about, we're seeing any progress. One of my, just a single example, one of my undergrads is now working at Deloitte, and she's doing workplace trends. And the top 10 trends for government and private for this past year did not include anything like this. So there were a changing nature of the workforce, there was technology, there was virtual work, there was a lot of stuff that was the kind of effects that we are talking about, but there was blessedly absent the millennial problem. Now that's partly driven by maybe the way the survey was constructed, but it wasn't popping up. I don't know. I think if I were a practitioner, I could hang up a shingle and sell this to organizations. I'm a lowly academic, and so I wait for them to come to me. But I'm open to suggestions. I mean, how do you get the word out to the people who are practicing this? And again, some people are making a lot of money on this. And if I'm a business person and someone comes up to me and says, "Hey, I can help you solve your millennial problem for only $10,000," or I come up to them and say, "Hey, I can show you that you don't have a millennial problem for only $10,000. Guess which one they're going to pay?" Right? Especially when it goes back to there's enough. I mean, think of the distribution, confirmation bias. There's enough lazy, narcissistic, unmotivated millennials to lock that in, right? So as long as they're seeing a few of them and the stereotypes are kind of unbroken, Yeah, it's frustrating. It's very frustrating, and I don't really know what you do other than you keep saying it in as many venues. So I went to a high tech conference in Boston last year and gave similar talk to this to people like TripAdvisor and Wayfair and companies like that, the kind of Boston high tech quarter, to a lot of younger HR types, and they were all stunned by most of this. And afterwards, I was having a conversation with one of the managers, and she said, I got to say you're wrong. It's like, my assistant is a perfect example of this. I said, she said she doesn't answer her emails, she doesn't answer the phone, she doesn't do these types of things that I want her to do, and she's such a millennial. And I said, have you talked to her about what you want her work to look like? Have you given her a job description? Have you offered training? No, she wouldn't take any of that. And I said, if she were 50 years old, would you be saying the same thing about her? If she did the exact same things, would you be equally upset? And she said, of course. I said, would you blame her for being that way because she's a baby boomer? And she said, no. I said, so why are you blaming her for being a millennial? She's a bad worker. Train her or fire her. And she said, oh. But, what?
I was in a class where they were touting all of these generational differences, and everybody was just eating it up.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, you've got to be kidding me. And I said, hold the phone. If you took generation, if you took Gen X, baby boomer, millennial out, and you replaced that with female, if you replace that with African American, what does that sound like to you? And they were like, oh, we would never do that.
There's no generational discrimination in the Workplace Act.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And
Well, you can invite me to the meeting. I'd be happy to tell them that. Yeah, I'm fine with that. I've got one daughter in private school and another one coming up, so that would be very nice. I think, as practitioners, as academics, you do it a little bit at a time. And I think kind of reinforcing I think what you said is exactly right. I mean, feel free I'll send you that Husky Women in the Workplace vote if you want, and watch them look at it. And I love putting it up there, one, because like I said, but I like watching people's face when they read it, because usually they're reading a little bit ahead of me, and they're going, and it's like, but just substitute in any of the other stereotypical phrases we have, and they're unacceptable. But in this case, they still are. And I think that's a good question to ask, which is, why is that okay? And you can provide counterfactuals and say, hey, you just said this millennial did this thing. I said, is there another person who's the same age in your work group who's terrific? What do they look like? What's different about them? Oh, well, they show up on time and they're motivated. And I said, they're 28. Well, but I think that's kind of the way you have to do it. I mean, how do you dispel any stereotypes, right? Exposure, education, counterfactuals. And I think we can keep, again, I like the people working on the definitions. If you could come up with an induced definition of generations that's driven by the stock market, whatever, that'd be really interesting to say, look, it's not these artificial calendar things. And again, it's that 20-year breakdown, because that's the biological generation. But then you have to ask yourself, well, why did it go 1820 to 1840, 1840 to 1860, but then it goes 1900 to 1918, and then I don't know what the exact thing is, 1919 to 1946, and then 46 to 64, and then 64 to 81, because we've tried to kind of superimpose these events. So it started off as a literal generation and critical events, and it's morphed into the events are creating the generation. And if I had to write a book at some point, that would be the point, which is the underlying idea has morphed away from this kind of historical sociological view of things, which is interesting and may have some relevance, to let's find the critical events that make these people the way they are. And to me, the dead giveaway is you just look at the years that define these things and look how they start shifting around based on what people perceive these events to be. And just the shifting deadlines for the shifting boundaries for what the generations are.
I think you need to write a book. I think you need to write a business book.
Yeah, if I do.
They're not reading
Yeah.
journal articles.
Yeah, they're not. I've done every interview I can. Happy to do interviews.
Harvard Business Review.
You know what?
That's what you mean.
Here's an interesting thing. The paper that became Costanza and Finkelstein 2015, which was the focal article in Perspectives in IO Psych, which generated all sorts of interesting responses, was dead rejected by HBR. And we even spun it because they had a couple pieces in the years prior to that said basically the opposite of what we were saying. And we said, we want to provide an alternate perspective. And here's what they said, and here's what we said, and here's the evidence to back it up, and here's why your readers would care about it. And we got an email back from an editorial assistant saying, we're not interested. California Management Review dead rejected it. And so Lisa and I went back and forth saying, we want to get this out to practitioners, how they're going to see it. And we considered like doing an OD journal. We considered doing an op-ed just to get it out there. And I said, if HBR and CM aren't going to take it, I don't want to put it in a super low OD journal that no one's going to read. So maybe we ramp it up and go a bit more academic, and it ended up being a focal article in IOP. I thought that issue was terrific. I thought the responses that came in were really good. It generated a lot of conversation. Kevin Murphy loved it because people were fighting about stuff, and anytime people fight about stuff, Kevin Murphy likes it. But we tried. We tried, believe me.
You need a groundswell.
I've thought about the book. I think when I run out of like really good empirical ideas for trying to do this, there's got to be a pop press book in there, which is everything you learned about millennials was wrong. And you know what? I got to get full first, and a few other things off my checklist, and then it's on there because I think that's probably how you have to go after it. Twangy's big seller is Generation Me, right? Which is a pop press backed up by her science. Yes, sir.
It seems to me that with the methodology you work so hard at, finding something that maybe isn't there, has a lot of potential for more useful questions. Because anything that's across generations, situations, ages, is very complicated. Do you see any particular issues that haven't been looked at, looking over periods of time across ages, that might be addressed better than they were in the past? Using these newer methods.
Yeah. So are there other variables or ideas that we might apply some of these findings to? The Work Age and Retirement Journal, that whole special issue and some of the pieces in there came out of a meeting I attended called Age in the Workplace, which is basically aging researchers. And I think Mo Wang is the editor of Work, Aging, and Retirement, and one of the things he's trying to do is bring some of the aging literature into the more IO realm. And I think they could teach us an awful lot about generations, so I think that way coming in is helpful. Probably one of the biggest things I learned from going to that conference, it was a terrific conference, was the different definitions of age. There's biological age, and there's psychological age, and there's career age, and there's subjective age, and it's really kind of similar to the different definitions of generations. And so I had some nice conversations with some aging researchers about how they try to nail down what it means to be 60. Like, I say I'm 60, you say I'm 60, I feel 60, I act 60. What does that all mean? So I think that way is beneficial. In terms of going out, some of the other research I've done that's not in generations is getting into the impact of time. And so there are lots of areas in IO Psych and HR in general that I think would benefit. Turnover is a really good example. Most models of turnover are fairly static. How likely are you to quit your job today? But we know that voluntary turnover is a time-based and time-varying phenomenon. So if I ask you today and I ask you last week and I ask you next month, your how likely are you to leave is going to change as a function of things, but we tend to see it as this kind of static. So there's a case where a lot of the turnover literature is also kind of cross-sectional stuff, but the use of survival analysis and the use of time lag designs to get at the changing nature, the dynamic aspects of turnover is one. We published another piece in Journal of Business Psych that looked at the effect of adaptive cultures on organizational survival over time, and we used some of the ideas about the changing nature of variables over time in that literature. So I definitely think there's some areas in IO and in HR in general that would benefit from this kind of more time-based thinking. And we've got a couple things that have done that, but it's something again, it's harder to do, right? It's a lot easier to, look at organizations today or look at people today than it is to try to figure out what happened. So the creative stuff that I'm seeing in that is where there are these kind of existing data sets. So for our adaptive culture study, we went back and found information about organizations all the way back to the 1900s, early 1900s, late 1800s, and we know what happened to them, so we went back and found what they were like when they were founded and then see whether or not that predicted their survival. What we found in general is the more adaptive their culture was at founding impacted their likelihood of surviving as many as 80 or 100 years later. And some of the stuff on turnover, which is also based on Army data, looking at how turnover changes as a function of the unemployment rate, as it changes as a function of the broader economy, as it changes as a result of command climate. Like when you get a new commander in and the commander's really awful, guess what? Everybody's intention to leave goes up. And trying to capture that is I think, a good area that we could use some of these ideas in. Absolutely.
Are there any economists who are interested in this stuff? Get them interested in thinking really sometimes, or else it's very dull.
Yeah, are economists interested? Economists tend to be interested in the average consumer, the average product, the average company. So to the extent that they might look at consumer averages or spending averages or something like that, I suppose. I have not come across any that think about generations the way we do. One of the things that we did initially for the meta-analysis was look at how other disciplines define generations. And when you get out of the psych, soc, anthropological, it's really, really limited. There's not a lot of economists who think about it. There's not a lot of political scientists who think about it the way we do. And if you go back to like the origin of generations, it's psychological, sociological, and so that's not terribly surprising. Yeah. Anything else?
You've already given us an extra 15 minutes, so thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks.